Can a bullet be taught to think? How do you destroy an enemy aircraft you can barely see with a shell that knows precisely when to strike? In the dark days of 1943, the answer to this question would unfold in a flash of unseen fire over the Pacific, forever altering the calculus of war. At 0730 on the morning of January 5, 1943, Lieutenant Red Cochrane stood in the vibrating heart of the USS Helena's Fire Control Center. The air was thick with the metallic tang of spent propellant as he watched 4 Japanese VAL dive bombers claw their way into the sky, away from his cruiser, their deadly work near Guadalcanal seemingly done. At 31 years old, with a full year of the Pacific's brutal war etched into his features, Cochrane had yet to score a single kill with the revolutionary new shells locked in his ship's magazines. The VALs were already 2 miles out and accelerating, a hopeless distance for the ship's 20mm cannons. Just months earlier, in October, the Helena had taken aboard 500 rounds of experimental ammunition. Each shell cost an astonishing $732, a king's ransom compared to a standard round. They were designated with a cryptic name, variable time fuses. In truth, they were weapons that were not supposed to exist. Standard 5-inch anti-aircraft gunnery was a brutal, unforgiving exercise in predictive mathematics. Gunners had to calculate exactly where a speeding aircraft would be in 3 seconds, manually set a mechanical timer on each individual shell, and then fire, praying their calculations were correct. The math was so unforgiving that for every Japanese plane shot down over the Pacific in 1942, American ships had unleashed an average of 2,000 rounds. 2,000 shells for a single kill. Cochrane had personally watched the ordnance crews load the new shells that morning. They were a marvel of miniaturization, a secret world of technology packed into a warhead. Each fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, 5 delicate vacuum tubes made of glass, a battery ingeniously designed to be activated by the violent shock of firing, and 130 other electronic components, all crammed into a space no larger than a Coca-Cola bottle. The Navy had issued a strict, non-negotiable order. These shells were forbidden from use over land. If the Japanese were to recover even one dud, they could potentially reverse engineer the technology, erasing a decisive American advantage. But here, over the deep waters 2 miles from Guadalcanal, the risk was deemed acceptable. A voice cut through the tension as the fire control officer called out the firing solution. Cochrane's battery of 5-inch guns whirred, training their long barrels on the lead valve. The bomber was a rapidly shrinking silhouette, diving for the safety of the horizon. Standard doctrine screamed to let them go, to conserve precious ammunition for the next inevitable attack. But Cochrane had a different mandate. His orders were to test these new shells in the crucible of combat.
This was the moment. 3 gun captains stood poised, their hands on the triggers. Cochrane gave the command. The first salvo erupted from the guns at 0732. 3 shells, fitted with standard time fuses, screamed towards the target. They detonated 1,000 feet behind the VAL in 3 useless puffs of black smoke. The bomber flew on, unscathed. Then came the second salvo. 3 more shells, but these were different. These were the experimental rounds. Radio proximity fuses. VT fuses. Through his binoculars, Cochrane tracked their impossibly fast descent. There were no visible explosions, no familiar black bursts of shrapnel that marked the end of a time fuse's journey. There were only 3 silent projectiles arcing towards a target now 2.5 miles distant. And then it happened. The VAL's left wing simply folded upwards, separating from the fuselage as if torn off by an invisible hand. The bomber rolled violently, inverted, and plunged into the sea at 240 knots. The total time from Cochrane's order to the enemy's destruction was a mere 18 seconds. A stunned silence fell over the gun crews. No one had seen the shells detonate. The bomber had simply, inexplicably, come apart in midair. What the crew of the Helena had just witnessed was not magic, but a revolution in warfare. But how did these shells know when to explode? What miracle of engineering allowed them to function under forces that would crush a man into pulp? The answer to their questions was not on the bridge of the Helena, but being desperately awaited 1,500 miles away at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in Maryland. There, a physicist named Merle Tuve was waiting for this exact radio message. He was waiting to learn if 3 years of seemingly impossible engineering had just paid off. Waiting to find out if fragile glass vacuum tubes could survive 20,000 times the force of gravity and still perform their function. Because if the answer was yes, the scientists of his clandestine Section T had just handed the Allies a weapon that would change naval warfare forever. This stunning success had been foreshadowed 5 months earlier, on August 12, 1942, when those same scientists had convinced the U.S. Navy to cancel all further testing after a demonstration so successful it bordered on unbelievable. On that day, the newly commissioned light cruiser USS Cleveland lay anchored in the placid waters of Chesapeake Bay for weapons testing. Aboard its bridge stood Dr. Merle Tuve, a 41-year-old physicist who for 3 years had directed Section T, a project employing 200 scientists and engineers on a weapon most of them privately believed was a physicist's fantasy. The ship carried 300 of the experimental shells, codenamed Posit by the Bureau of Ordnance. At 900 hours, the target appeared, a radio-controlled drone aircraft simulating a torpedo run just above the waves.
Standard Navy doctrine anticipated that it would take 500 to 800 rounds to destroy such a maneuvering target. The Cleveland's crew had been briefed. Fire a maximum of 4 salvos, 12 shells. If the drone survived, the test was a failure. At 0903, the first salvo of 3 shells with the new proximity fuses roared from the guns. The drone was 800 yards out, closing fast. Tuve watched, his binoculars pressed to his eyes. He saw no detonations. Then, the drone's engine simply cut out. The aircraft nosed down and slammed into the water. Elapsed time, 7 seconds. The gunnery officer, astonished, requested permission to fire again. A second drone was launched at 0915. A second salvo destroyed it in 6 seconds. When the test coordinator radioed for a third drone, the response was negative. The Navy had brought 6 drones, assuming hundreds of rounds would be fired. They needed to conserve the remaining 3 for other tests. Tuve insisted, 1 more run. At 0940, a third drone launched, this time simulating a high-altitude bombing run at 12,000 feet. The Cleveland's guns elevated, and a third salvo was fired. The drone disintegrated at 11,800 feet. The test coordinator immediately shut down the exercise. The Navy had just watched a single cruiser destroy 3 maneuvering targets with a total of 10 shells. They had come prepared for failure. They were utterly unprepared for this level of success. The story of those 10 shells began 2 years earlier, in August 1940, when Tuve received a classified briefing from the British Tizard mission. British scientists had shared their pioneering research on proximity fuses. They had made them work in unguided rockets, but the Royal Navy needed them for 5-inch guns, which generated forces no existing electronics could withstand. 20,000 Gs at firing and a spin of 25,000 revolutions per minute. The British, General Electric, and RCA all deemed it impossible. Tuve, looking at the British diagrams, boldly told the National Defense Research Committee he could have working prototypes in 6 months. He was spectacularly wrong. It would take 18 agonizing months. The first problem was the sheer, brutal physics. A 5-inch shell accelerates from 0 to 2,800 feet per second in 8 milliseconds. The rifling spins it to 25,000 RPM. Any vacuum tube of the era would be pulverized. Tuve needed 5 of them in every shell, and they all had to work perfectly after surviving this cataclysmic launch. The solution fell to a 26-year-old physicist who would later discover the radiation belts around Earth, James Van Allen. His assignment was simple and impossible: design glass tubes that could survive 20,000 Gs. Van Allen began by systematically destroying tubes. He dropped them off buildings, fired bullets at them, and shot them from air cannons. For 6 months, every attempt ended in the same way, with a puff of glass powder and a tangle of twisted filaments. The breakthrough came in March 1941. Working with Raytheon engineers on miniaturized hearing aid tubes, Van Allen had a realization. Smaller tubes meant less mass, and less mass meant lower stress forces. He redesigned the entire internal structure, mounting filaments on thick steel wire and potting the assembly in hard wax. The new tubes looked like oversized Christmas light filaments in glass capsules. The first test at Dahlgren Proving Ground in April 1941 yielded a 33% survival rate. Not good enough. Van Allen and his team went back to work, reinforcing, thickening, and redesigning. By January 1942, the survival rate reached 58%. It was a coin toss, but a coin toss the Navy was now willing to take. Sylvania Electric was contracted, hiring 10,000 workers, mostly women, to assemble the miniature tubes by hand. By late 1942, they were producing 1 million tubes every 2.5 days. Yet another project-killing obstacle remained: the battery. Standard batteries had a short shelf life. The Navy needed shells that could sit in magazines for years. Tuve's team designed a wet cell battery where the shock of firing shattered a glass ampule of electrolyte, which was then forced by centrifugal force into stacked plates, generating electricity. National Carbon Corporation spent 8 months perfecting a glass ampule just 0.015 inches thick, strong enough to handle but fragile enough to break on firing. By the summer of 1942, all the impossible pieces existed, leading directly to the stunning demonstration aboard the USS Cleveland. But Tuve knew a secret the Navy didn't. The fuses still had a 52% failure rate. Nearly half would be duds. And if the Japanese recovered one working fuse, they would hold the keys to America's most secret weapon. This immense risk weighed on Commander William Parsons in October 1942 as he supervised the loading of 5,000 VT-fused shells at Mare Island. Parsons, a naval ordnance expert who would later arm the atomic bomb aboard the Enola Gay, had explicit orders: deliver the shells, train the crews, and, most critically, ensure no duds fell into enemy hands. The combined chiefs of staff had established an absolute rule: the fuses could only be used over deep water where any failures would sink beyond recovery. Admiral William Bull Halsey met Parsons in New Caledonia and, after reviewing the Chesapeake Bay results, added one ship to the priority list alongside the carriers, Enterprise and Saratoga, the USS Helena. She was a veteran of Pearl Harbor, a battle-hardened ship whose crew desperately needed an edge. In October 1942, American ships in the South Pacific had fired 36,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition to shoot down just 58 planes. The math was unsustainable. The Helena received 500 VT-fused shells on November 8th. The crews were told only that the shells would explode near the target automatically. That was all they needed to know. After 2 months of waiting, the moment arrived on January 5, 1943. Following a shore bombardment mission, the Helena was attacked by 4 Val's dive bombers. One bomb struck the New Zealand cruiser Achilles. As the Vals retreated, Helena's gun directors tracked them. The range, speed, and angle made a shot with standard timed fuses a near impossibility. This was when Lieutenant Cochrane made his fateful decision, firing the second salvo of VT fused shells that resulted in the silent, shocking destruction of the enemy bomber. The after-action report, written by Parsons that night, made its way to Halsey, then to Pearl Harbor, and finally to Washington. On January 7th, Merle Tuve received the coded message, Helena, January 5th, 1 kill, 3 rounds. The scientists at Section T were subdued. 1 kill was not a trend. They needed more data. The data came with astonishing speed. Throughout January, the Helena's gun crews engaged Japanese aircraft 4 more times, destroying a total of 8 planes with just 36 VT-fused rounds. The average was 4.5 shells per kill, compared to the previous average of 621. The VT fuse was 138 times more effective. Production was massively ramped up, but the embargo remained firm. No use over land. The risk of capture was too great. That is, until the entire Western Front was on the verge of collapse. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched a massive offensive through the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. With Allied air support grounded by impenetrable weather, General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, knew that artillery was his only hope. He asked his staff about the VT fuses, the miracle shells from the Pacific. He was told they were forbidden for land use. Facing a potential catastrophe, Eisenhower made a decision that would echo across the battlefield. He overruled the Navy. The embargo was lifted. On December 20th, 200,000 VT-fused artillery shells arrived at the front. Set to detonate 10 to 15 feet above the ground, they would unleash a cone of shrapnel downwards. It was a vertical storm of steel. Trenches offered no sanctuary. Foxholes became graves. Colonel George Axelson's artillery group fired them at an advancing German column, inflicting 72 casualties in a single barrage. The German advance halted. General George S. Patton witnessed a similar effect, writing to the War Department, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad that you all thought of it first." Yet the fuse's greatest test was still to come, back in the Pacific, against a terrifying new form of warfare born from desperation, the kamikaze. On October 25, 1944, at the Battle of Ley Gulf, Japanese pilots began to deliberately crash their bomb-laden aircraft into American ships. They didn't need to survive. They only needed to reach their target. This made them incredibly difficult to stop. The VT fuse became the fleet's last best defense. By eliminating the need for precise prediction, it allowed gunners to throw up a lethal wall of shrapnel that could shred an incoming kamikaze before it reached its target. The data was stark. The VT fuse increased the kill rate against kamikazes 6-fold. During the hellish Battle of Okinawa, where over 1,500 kamikaze attacks were launched, the fuse was credited with saving countless ships and lives. By the war's end, 22 million VT fuses had been produced at a cost of over $1 billion. They had defended London from V-1 flying bombs, devastated German armies in Europe, and shielded the fleet from suicide attacks in the Pacific. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal called it the weapon that helped blaze the trail to Japan. Merle Tuve, the man who led the project, returned quietly to his research after the war. James Van Allen became famous for discovering the radiation belts that now bear his name, his wartime crucible largely forgotten. Lieutenant Red Cochrane, who fired the first shot, left the Navy in 1946, his role in history sealed by classification. The USS Helena, the ship that proved the weapon, was sunk by Japanese torpedoes on July 6, 1943. Her wreck now rests in the silent darkness of the Solomon Islands. The technology, however, did not die. The fundamental principles born in the desperate laboratories of Section T live on, protecting naval vessels to this day in the radar-guided proximity fuses of modern missiles. It all began with an impossible challenge: to place a thinking machine inside a speeding shell. It ended by changing the very nature of warfare forever.